Pleasure to be here today. Thank you, Matthew, for joining us. A few words about us. Kumra Capital is a late-stage or growth capital investor out of Israel. But I think, interestingly, most of our portfolio companies are today headquartered in New York. So even though we're Israeli investors and we are focused on Israeli tech companies, we actually spend a lot of our time here, both in terms of the companies that we are within the portfolio and in terms of deal flow of Israeli companies which are already very active and domiciled here. So we wanted to take a bit of a break from tech and cyber and intelligence and talk a little about what does it mean to bridge this cultural business gap between Tel Aviv and New York. And even though Tel Aviv and New York seem to be close communities, there are still a lot of challenges when moving offices from Tel Aviv to New York. So I'd like to present in a few words Matthew. So Matthew Brondtman is, first of all, a close friend. He's a New York-based businessman, entrepreneur, and philanthropist. He's one of the most active Jewish-American investors in the Israeli economy, currently owning IKEA in Israel, and previously major owner of Israel Discount Bank, Shufersal, among other investments. Among his nonprofit activities, he's chairman of the steering committee of Limud FSU, a program focused on strengthening the Jewish identities of Russian Jews. He's chairman of the board of trustees of the AGC and chairman emeritus of AGC Jerusalem. AGC is the world's leading Jewish advocacy organization. Matthew is married to an Israeli, father of 8, and spends a growing amount of his time in Tel Aviv. So Matthew, your family has always been very involved with Israel, both in business and philanthropy. Yes. When did you start getting personally involved with Israel and business in Israel?
First of all, thank you, everybody, for being here. Thank you, Erez, for asking me to this conference. So I started really investing in Israel at the height of the Second Intifada in 2002, 2003.
Great timing.
Well, yes, people thought I was stark raving mad, but in fact, it was good timing. It was not done based on thinking that things were terrible and that things would get better. I did think they would get better, but it was a little bit of a struggle to figure out how to bridge the cultural divide between America and I grew up in a family that had always done a lot of philanthropy in Israel, but my dad had a philosophy which was basically, in those days, we're talking about really the 80s and 90s, before we started, which was you give money to Israel, you don't invest in Israel. And I had a little different philosophy, which was that Israel is going to grow up and Israel is going to be sustainable, and therefore we need to switch from being sort of only philanthropy to also investing in a growing economy. And so we really started in 2003 was when we made our first investment in what was called the Blue Square, Rabu Kahol, which was then the second largest supermarket chain. Obviously, lots happened in that industry and over the last 16, 17 years.
Yes. So tell us a little about the differences between doing business in the US and doing business in Israel.
First of all, I think most businesses are local. And so you have to understand the local culture and the local landscape. And so things are different. One of the things was sort of a cultural shock for me, which you all will understand, is that in Israel, when I would sort of give a suggestion to one of the guys working for us, they would basically tell me I'm an idiot. They would be very aggressive in their communication of their opinions. In America, the people are a lot more polite. At least that's been my experience. They may disagree with you. They will tell you gently. They will not confront you. Having said that, at the end of the day, I found anyway that once a decision is made, the people in Israel are really soldiers. They'll fight, they'll argue with you, but once a decision is made, they'll implement it. Here, there's a little more politics, backstabbing. They don't necessarily implement it. They come up with excuses. So sort of the confrontation is more out there, and I find that refreshing. But it did take a while for me to sort of get used to that kind of aggressiveness in the conversation.
But by now, I think that you've become half Israeli. And
I think so. I think so.
When you look at Israeli businesses that you invest in, do you have some kind of an emotional discount when looking at these businesses? I mean, do you measure them differently than your business here in the U.S.?
That's a great question, and certainly when we invested in Discount Bank, people asked me that a lot, and the answer was really twofold. First of all, had there been an auction of a bank in Greece or Turkey or Bulgaria, we would not have looked at it. Right? That does not mean that our economic considerations were different, but there's clearly an emotional tie to Israel and doing business in Israel and with Israelis and trying to support the economy. But that doesn't mean, again, we want to take a discount on our return expectations. So it's a little bit of yes and a little bit of no. I hate to be a lawyer on that. So, on one hand, yes. But I think that there is, as much as what they say about England, two nations separated by common language. So as much as there is a commonality of purpose and identity of being Jewish and caring about certain things, there is a tie to want to do business in Israel, but there's no reason to take an economic hit for that.
Yeah, so maybe the initial motivation of getting
correct,
there is
and looking at it and being able to feel, I feel very, very much at home in Israel. Not just because I have an Israeli wife. I've felt comfortable there since my first visit many, many years ago.
So you invested in banking and in retail in Israel and areas which have a lot of government involvement and regulation involved. How was the communication with the Israeli regulators as opposed to the U.S. regulators that you work with?
So we haven't done a lot of investing in regulated, well, I haven't done a lot of investing in regulated businesses in America. Of course, my family, which comes from the beverage alcohol industry, it's a very regulated business, but I never worked for the Seagram company. I can tell you that when we were looking at the investment in the bank, I said to my family that they were very concerned about the potential for bad loans, and obviously there's a huge book of reserves, and what would happen to those reserves over the ensuing few years, and I said to my family, do not worry about the bad debts. I said they may be off by a little bit, but frankly, the Bank of Israel is so in their underwear, frankly, that it's not going to be an issue. I said you have two real things to worry about. One is the unions, and one are the regulators and changing regulations. Unfortunately, that proved to be very prophetic because, Discount Bank had the toughest union in Israel, and we were never able to really do anything about it, and the regulations never stopped coming. The regulators were very, very aggressive, which, of course, was also only amplified by the financial crisis. We made our investment prior to the financial crisis, not very good timing. And the amplification of the regulations, the increase in capital adequacy requirements, et cetera, made it very difficult. And I would tell you today that I don't think we would invest in another regulated business in Israel. The regulators are, and I get where they're coming from. They've got a view of really protecting the citizens of Israel and not being taken advantage of. I do think, however, that when we bought the bank, today's re-elected prime minister was the finance minister, and we spent a fair amount of time talking to him during the process, and he told me, listen, we really want a third strong bank to compete with Leumi and Poalim. So once you buy Discount, go and buy one of the other banks and merge them together. And so we went to them with two alternatives, and we were turned down both times by the regulators, saying that no, actually having 5-6 banks is better than having a third large competitor. So I'm not saying we were duped, but as finance minister was one thing, and then the baton was passed to the Bank of Israel, and the governor and the governor's staff did not think that a merger between Discount and any of the other banks was something that they were going to approve. So.
We've been very accustomed for many years to have U.S. investors in Israel and U.S. companies which are establishing offices in Israel and so on. In the last decade, there has been hundreds of Israeli tech companies that established offices here in New York and actually provided jobs in the city and so on. Is the business relationship becoming more bilateral? Do you feel it in your businesses as well?
I think it's absolutely becoming more bilateral. And I think it's a phenomenal thing. I wish, as we're seeing companies stay private longer, I think that's a great thing. We don't, for IKEA, which is really the business we have, first of all, Discount Bank, of course, had a big presence here. I apologize to Lily, but at least when we were there, Discount was the largest presence in New York and in South America. So you already had that bilateral. IKEA is completely separate in terms of its franchise versus it's corporate owned, and they own it's corporately owned here in America. But I love the fact that Israeli companies have grown up to the point where they can be here. And you see, it was mentioned a minute ago, how not just Americans, but Chinese and everybody's coming to Israel for their technology. Israel is a completely different, in a very different place than it was close to 20 years ago when I started investing there. And I think it's phenomenal. As a Zionist, my one wish is that not so many Israelis would permanently leave and move to Silicon Valley or LA or New York, that it would be more temporary, because we need to strengthen the state of Israel even more. But that's a separate issue, not something that was really part of the question. But no, I think it's amazing, the technology that's come out of Israel and the amount of jobs that have been created here by Israeli companies and Israeli technologies. And you would not have predicted that 20 years ago.
Just the last question before we end this, we are out of time. There's a very thriving Jewish community in New York, and you're very active in the Jewish community here. And there's a very fast-growing Israeli tech community in New York. There's very little contact between them. I think definitely not formal, but not even in the informal levels. I don't see these two communities communicating a lot. Do you have any ideas of how to strengthen these bridges between these two communities?
Well, I think conferences like this are a good start. So thank you, Khalkalist. We were actually at dinner last night, we were kind of discussing tangentially that when Israelis are here and here for a while, and then they put their kids in school, you start to then integrate because of that. Just with the Israeli parents meeting the American parents who are sending their kids, hopefully your kids go to Ramaz or Heschel or one of the Jewish day schools, and then they really integrate. I think that it's hard. It's hard. I can tell you that for my wife, having her Israeli posse of friends was life-saving for her. And it is a challenge. We see it, you mentioned I do a lot of work with the Russian-speaking Jewish communities around the world. And one of the reasons we do that is because even after all these years of Russians being in America, there's still a separation between the Russian community, and it's all over the world. Even in Israel, the Russians are separate, and we find it all over, which is why we do these conferences, to try to instill Jewish values in the Russians who may not have it. But that really should be the local communities, the federation's job. And I know that the federations here work on it. It is hard. There is that cultural divide, and I think it is a challenge, but something that we need to work on.
Great. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure having you.
Thank you.